Ethics. What is good? Is it to fight for a cause of what is supposed to be right? Is it for the progress of humanity? Or is it to respect one's rights? Good, by definition, is that which is morally right? Is that of quality? Is that of something beneficial? Is that of which is desired? Is something that conforms to the moral order of the universe. However, these are all just definitions of the word good. We still have to answer the question, how can something or anything really be considered as good? One of the branches of philosophy actually tackles this question. In particular, ethics, which essentially asks the question, what is good? Filipino philosopher Florentino Timbreza defined ethics as a practical and normative science based on reason, which studies human acts and provides norms for their goodness and badness. Ethics is also known as moral philosophy, dealing with morality, moral rectitude, or the rightness and wrongness of human acts. Ethics also investigates facts, analyzes them, and draws from them practical applications to particular actions. An important note here is that ethics deals with human acts. But what exactly are human acts? For this, we have to know the difference between human acts and acts of man. In human acts, these are actions done with knowledge and full consent of the will. An example would be of Trump's knowledge, despite the opposition, and his full consent of the will in building the wall no matter the cost. In acts of man, these are actions done in the absence of either knowledge or volition or both. An example would be sleeping. Ethics can now be simply understood as a moral philosophy that deals with human actions done with knowledge and full consent of the will. The next question would be, is there any specific path or particular instructions that ethics can teach us to know and understand what is good? For this, we can try looking into and understand the different ethical schools of thought. First on the list, we have ethical relativism, also known as moral relativism. It claims that there are no universal or absolute moral principles, and that standards of right and wrong are always relative to a particular culture or society. The moral opinion of one individual or culture is as good as any other. An example that would relate to ethical relativism would be when we talk about balut. In Southeast Asia, especially in the Philippines, balut is most commonly sold as street food and is served as a delicacy. However, in Western countries, they find it disgusting and inhumane. In here, we see of how two different cultures view balut. Oh, and if you haven't known yet, balut is basically hard-boiled duck fetus. Furthermore, this situation relates to what ethical relativism is trying to teach, on whether balut should be still something to be eaten or not. Next on the list, we have hedonism. It teaches that pleasure is the norm of morality and is the one and only good. Satisfaction of desire, the greater the pleasure, the better. Desires may be either intellectual, aesthetic, or physical. In hedonism, it says that happiness is the highest good. This is a picture of me consuming alcohol. Although it is gonna be bad for my health in the long run, I'm merely satisfying my desire to have a good drink. Thus, in what hedonism is teaching, is that by satisfying my desire to drink alcohol, I'm actually doing something good. Moving on, we next have Stoicism, which is the complete opposite of hedonism. In their ethical school of thought, they teach that apathy, or indifference to pleasure, is no moral norm. Apatheia, or stiff imperturbability, is the basis for moral action. To attain lasting happiness, we have to minimize our desires and passions, if we cannot suppress them altogether. An individual who is at peace with themselves and with others attains mental serenity and is thus happy. What the Stoic ethical school of thought is trying to teach, that in spite of the pain and hardships that we are experiencing, we have to still not display or involve any emotion at all, and should not complain. Next on the list, we have a school of thought that is in between Stoicism and Hedonism called Epicureanism. This school teaches that moderate pleasure is the moral norm, and that moderate pleasure is one that is consonant with reason, which is neither too much nor too little. For them, prudence is the highest virtue which enables an individual to govern himself by the use of reason. In teaching their ethical guidelines for making moral decisions, they relate it to the three kinds of desires. The first one is the natural and necessary desire, which should be satisfied moderately. Example would be as sleeping and eating. Second, there's the natural but unnecessary desire, which are optional. For the Epicureanism, they view sex as a natural but unnecessary desire. And third are the unnatural and unnecessary desire, which they deem dangerous. An example would be that of smoking and drinking. Next on the list, we have a very popular ethical school of thought called Utilitarianism. A school of thought that teaches that the rightness or wrongness of actions is determined by the goodness and badness of their consequences. It follows the principle of utility, and that actions are good insofar as they tend to promote happiness, bad as they tend to promote unhappiness. What matters is the greatest possible balance of happiness over unhappiness for all individuals affected, and that the great number of individuals must be benefited by the moral act or decision. What this ethical school is trying to teach is best exampled by a thought experiment called the trolley problem. Imagine that there is a loose trolley traveling at high speed towards 5 people tied up on the main track. You are standing next to a lever, which if you pull, will save the 5 people. However, on the side track, there is a single person tied up. You have two options, saving the 1 person or the 5 people. Utilitarianism teaches that saving 5 people will be the more ethical choice, as since that leads to the greater number of individuals. There are also many variations of the trolley problem that leads to more ethical options. Imagine the trolley is actually Thomas the Tank Engine, or throwing a fat man over the bridge to stop the track, or something as ridiculous as this. Next in the list, we have an ethical school of thought called Situationism, which basically teaches that the moral norm depends upon the given situation. But whatever the situation may be, one must always act in the name of Christian love. A situation here refers to a human condition or any state of moral affairs and issues that demands judgment or action. The Situationist enumerates 3 different types of love. The first is eros, erotic love, which is sexual love. Next is philia, which is filial love, which is the love between a parent and child, or sibling to sibling. Next is agape, agapic love, which is one's genuine care, concern, and kindness towards others. Christian love best exemplifies agapic love. For the Situationists, eros and philia are biased and partial, whereas agape, Christian love, is benevolent. In the biblical sense, Christian love is love of and for one's neighbor, just as the example led by Christ. In all this talk about love, the next ethical school of thought might be the complete opposite of Situationism, called Mightism, also known as power ethics. It teaches that might is right, literally, and that whenever an act enhances one's strength or capacity to rule or control others, it is good. It legitimizes the exercise of power, the use of force and violence, if necessary, insofar as this promotes one's capacity to control or influence others. We can see how this ethical school of thought operates by looking at what President Duterte is doing in the Philippines. His exercise of power and use of violence have enhanced his control and authority of the country in spite of international and local oppositions. By the doctrine of Mightism, what he is doing is considered to be good. And the bottom line, only those who are brave enough to chart their destiny by fair or foul means are fit to survive. Moving on to the next ethical school of thought, we have Deontologism, also known as duty ethics, which teaches that duty is the norm of moral actions, wherein, as Immanuel Kant puts it, one acts morally if and only if one does whatever one is obliged to do. What makes an act moral is it is being done out of duty. The bottom line is that one who does something merely because one feels like doing it is not acting morally. In the picture on the right is a screenshot of me making this PowerPoint presentation for an assignment. I am doing that because it's my duty as a student. Therefore, I am doing something good, even though I don't like it, to an extent. Next on the list, we have the Humanistic Ethics school of thought, also known as Eudaimonism, Nicomacheanism, Perfectionism, Self-realization, or Self-actualization. It teaches that self-realization is the true ultimate standard of morality. Any act that promotes self-realization is good, whereas all acts that hinder it are evil. It is life-affirming and death-denying. This is a picture of a friend of mine who really enjoys hiking in his spare time, although it might seem that he's just satisfying a desire, as according to the Hedonistic school of thought. He tells me of how he often finds himself whenever he is interacting with nature. By the doctrine of Humanistic Ethics, what he is doing is good as what he's doing leads to his self-actualization. Next, we have Natural Law Ethics. It posits that there exists a natural moral law, which is manifested by the natural light of human reason, demanding the preservation of the natural order and forbidding its violation. It teaches that the source of the moral law is reason itself, which directs us towards the good as the goal of our action, and that good is discoverable within our nature. It is in the principle of do good, avoid evil, also known as the voice of reason. We know we are acting rightly if we heed the voice of reason. Whenever an act is suitable to human nature as such, then it's good and it must be done. Bottom line, it teaches that the good is built into human nature. Take for example the actions of Oskar Schindler during World War II. In spite of being a member of the Nazi Party, he knew that what was happening to the Jewish people is wrong. Instead of being part of the Holocaust, he is credited with saving the lives of over 1,000 Jewish people. This is a prime example of what natural law ethics is trying to convey, in that the good is built into human nature. Now, last but not the least, ethical school of thought is Pragmatism, also known as Experimentalism. Despite being a theory of knowledge, moral interest and moral language appears in almost every important passage of the works of pragmatists. Pragmatism holds that the true and valid form of knowledge is one which is practical, workable, beneficial, and useful. It claims that the truth happens to an idea. It becomes true and is made true by events. Its verity is, in fact, an event, a process. The process namely of its verifying itself, its verification. Its validity is the process of its validation. The pragmatist consideration of the practicality, usefulness, workability, and beneficiality of the true and valid nature of knowledge can render a desperately needed service to applied ethics by providing a means for settling moral disputes. In that, to determine whether an idea is true or false, it must be tried and tested by experiment. It must be practical. For an example, let's take on this scenario. Imagine that there are conjoined twins on the verge of death, but it is possible to save one of them by separating them via surgery. The ethical dilemma here is to allow both twins to die, or to let one die to save another. Pragmatistic ethics asserts that saving one instead of letting both die is the more practical approach. Now that we have gone through all these different ethical schools of thought, maybe we should change the question of what is good to something, how can we know one thing that can be considered good? In the end, there is no actually sure answer. It all depends on you, of how you actually consider something to be good. Today, we talk about what ethics is, what are human acts, and discuss about the different ethical schools of thought. Until next time, and thanks for watching.